Well, hello, and welcome back. So my friend Aaron did agree to let me record this code review, so he doesn't know anything yet. We were just catching up as friends, and so now,
What are we talking about again, AJ?
So I'm going to get into that. See, he doesn't know anything. And so the last thing I left off is I've been doing some refactoring on this Auth project, and I've come to a point where I feel like I've got the right pieces in place, and I'm just kind of trying to make it more ergonomic and make sure that that the names of things are clear. And there's a little bit of frustration because there are things that most people don't know. Like, I think you're probably familiar with the idea of JWT claims because you've worked in that space, but the average developer is not. And so I don't want to be too technical, but I also don't want to put in too much abstraction. And so I'm going to go through a file that I've created. I'm actually going to make a second version of the file and then strip out a bunch of stuff to kind of show you bare bones-ish what this thing needs to be. And then just kind of ask for your feedback on some of how things are named or how some things might be able to be simplified, or I don't know. Well, we'll see what happens. But it's an authentication library that handles OIDC. Think of it like a modern passport, JWT based. So it handles OIDC like Google sign-in, but also handles password reset links, magic links, authentication, but a lot of it goes into a different layer. Meaning the library only handles so much of it, and then you pick up where it leaves off. But I'm going to go ahead and just try to strip this down a little bit so that I don't have so much boilerplate in the way of what we're actually trying to do. And that one is just a bunch of boilerplate that's going to need to be there. And feel free to ask a question at any time about anything.
I'm actually excited to take a look at this with you. You and I have worked together on some of these things in the past, and it is not a question that has gone away for exactly the reason you described. There's lots of people for whom PKI, private keys and JWTs and authentication in general is just a mystery.
Yeah. And I hope to not actually make it too much of not a mystery as much as I just want it to not be in the way, I guess. Okay, this needs to move. Okay, so that whole thing that I moved, I think I ended up just deciding not to move it. It's just complex and it has to be, oh well, I'll come back to it. So let me go down to where, and my demo does not work right now and my tests don't work right now because I was just in the middle of refactoring and I renamed a bunch of things. So I'm just gonna have to walk through the code and then show you. So, all right, so let's say that the Express app starts about here, which it does. And I can get rid of some of these. Now these comments are good comments. So if we're in development mode, this is stuff that I probably wouldn't need to put in the example. I'm kind of thinking this from the perspective of what would need to be in an example. And I'm kind of looking at Passport. I kind of was trying to draw some inspiration from the way that they do it. Because theirs looks pretty simple, but I think it's also too abstract and oversimplified. Because, for example, you never get access to the request object in any of these things that they have. It's all been narrowed down to like, here's 2 or 3 properties, and that's it. So if you wanted to look at something and make a, say, smarter decision, you can't unless you custom build the everything. So mine is not that simple in terms of narrowing things down to 2 or 3 properties, but it's not that complex in that you have to build out a plugin if you want custom functionality.
That's actually one of my chief concerns with Passport is how you essentially have to override properties, function properties to override methods to customize anything, and it becomes a game of jumping from place to place to try to figure out what actually is happening.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I want to avoid is my experience was the same with Passport. When I used Passport, in order to figure out where something was happening, I ended up checking into 5 or 6 different functions that ended up really just being decorators that were transforming an object in some way, doing something rather light where it's like they callbackified it too much. Like I said before, a little too abstract. Anyway, so what we have here is you decide where you want to mount it. And then as I've put in the little documentation comment here, this is going to have stuff like session, refresh, exchange. I think there's a couple of other ones. Challenge is one that I added for the process that works for doing magic links, doing email verification, and doing password resets. It's all the same API-wise. It's just up to you on the front end how you want to present it to your backend to then make the choice of what email template that you send out, which is totally agnostic to this framework. But session is dealing with getting a JWT, or a cookie. Refresh is using the cookie to get a new JWT that's either an ID token, meaning representing the identity of the user, or an access token, meaning representing like a role or a permission or something like that. And then the refresh and the exchange are similar.
Exchanging a cookie for a token.
I think refresh was exchanging the cookie for the token because the refresh token is in the cookie.
Okay.
So that JavaScript doesn't have access to it, so that the ID tokens and access tokens are short-lived. The exchange was if you have an ID token and you want to exchange it for an access token, which maybe is redundant because that could probably just be done at like refresh and exchange could probably be merged into one. But I had them separate because one is you're exchanging. The idea was that you use your cookie to get an ID token, but you could just post extra information to it, especially in the format that it is now, which we'll see in just a second. But you could post additional information that then you're going to get, and then you could decide what type of token you want to give back in both cases. So I should probably just merge it together into Exchange. But every time you refresh the page, you're going to want to hit the refresh endpoint. This way you don't have to store a cookie in local, or not a cookie. You don't have to store your JWT in local storage. And then when it expires, you just hit that. So it's what handles the cookie. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So that's what session middleware is. It's just this block set of endpoints, and you do have the capability of putting this at something different if you wanted to. You could call it foobar, but I think in the document
makes sense. Auth makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's what I'm going to document it as. And I just changed that so that it is agnostic, whereas before I'd hard-coded it because I try to hard-code things first, make some maybe poor decisions, and then go back every couple hours and then, refactor some of the things I've done. So the next bit, you don't have any choice in this. These are RFC standardized. Well, I think this is RFC standardized, and the other one, I don't think it's an RFC, but it's like a de facto standard. But the .well-known OpenID configuration and Jwks.Json, these you don't have any option of where they go. That's where they go as per spec. So
I might argue that since the OpenID configuration will contain a link to the JWKS, you could make that configurable, but I don't argue. I'm not arguing with what you're doing.
So you're right, you can make it configurable depending on which spec you're following. Because if you're following the OpenID config spec, then Jwks.Json is configurable. But if you're following the spec that was put forth, I think it's by Auth 0, then well-known Jwks.Json is the place for it. So there's two specs. One of them defines this as user configurable. The other defines it exactly as this. And so the OpenID configuration will return exactly this.
Might as well. Makes sense.
And this is not a full OpenID configuration at this point. It just has the bare minimum number of things. But anyway, so this is basically, you use the library at these two places, and that is all of the the bits that are necessary in order to handle the logging the user in. And then there is another piece of the library which is handling, let's see if this will stay on one line now that it's smaller. Yes, it will. So this piece of the library, which tentatively is just named JWT, verify JWT for no reason in particular. Well, I guess it does make sense, but I'd like to have maybe something a little better for that later on. But this, you just tell it what issuer you allow or what issuers. You could put an array of issuers. And you don't actually need to provide the key because it will go fetch the key and then cache it from the JWKS configuration. And on the stuff that we were working on, we had this the same both in Go and Node, where this type of stuff was taking place. And it would...
Python now, actually. But
what's that?
If you worked in the Python, but I'm working on it in Python as well.
Oh, okay. So anyway, all you need to do is specify the issuer and whether you want strict to be true or false. Strict true would mean that none shall pass. Either you have a valid token or you don't pass. And strict false would mean if you don't have a token, you can still go through and maybe there are guest privileges to some of these APIs. But if you have an invalid token, then you would get rejected.
So I get where you're going with strict. I thought you might have been strict, might have been like enabling some of the test sort of things that we've done in the past, where we were passing around JWTs in an HTTP environment that you'd never want to deploy. Right?
Yeah.
But you needed it for testing or something like that?
Yeah, so it'll actually print a warning to the screen and say, so this is the environment file. These are all test values, so they're perfectly fine to see. Key fetch allow insecure HTTP equals true.
There's our old friend.
Yeah, so if this is not set, then it's going to print out an error as your as this starts up.
So this builds on some of the previous work that you've done in this area.
Yes, yes, indeed. So I actually had a version of this in Go, but then I had to abandon that and then start it over in Node again because reasons. I would prefer the Go version, but because of just certain constraints, that I got halfway with the Go version, and then, so I'm not going to open up the browser window that I was going to open up, so I'll just go back there. But story time. This is the story of my life because, you know, I've complained about this multiple times. Every single time that I write an authentication library and I think, okay, great, this is good. This works well. This is smooth. Then some sort of standard changes or browser behavior changes, and then my work is broken. So what I had done, which doesn't affect the server side of the Go code, but is why I can't reuse the client side of the Go code, is now browsers, I think Chrome is the only browser left that doesn't disable third-party cookies by default.
Right.
So that means you don't get cookies, you don't get local storage, you don't get session storage. The only way that you could get basically session data in an iframe is if outside of the iframe you get the session data and then you pass it in to the URL. So you could pass a URL into like a JWT into the URL of an iframe, and you could establish a session that way. But the only way inside of the iframe itself to establish the session is actually to go through the full login process. So seamless login is now no longer possible. So there's that. And so now I'm back to literally the only thing that we can do until Portals comes out is to have the redirect or to have the pop-up, but that gets confusing. And doing the, like the Google sign-in pop-up, it's not going to work because people can't handle it.
Could you use a post message to post a message to the iframe? or back and forth, do an exchange that way?
Okay, so you could do that. You could do a post message rather than putting in the URL, but the thing is that the communication, the iframe will not be logged in. So you will have to redo, you have to already be logged in. So if you had an embedded application, so say like the tool that you're working on, if you needed to white label that for someone and you wanted to embed that application into an iframe, you would not be able to use local storage, session storage, cookies, or a couple of other things, but you would be able to run your application in an iframe, and you could use post message, I believe. No, you can use the URL, but you could also use post message probably to send a JWT into the iframe, so that, you know, if you had a wrapper authentication service because of the way that API partnership worked out with the customer you're white labeling for. Anyway, you could get the information in, but you could not get the information out. You cannot have a seamless experience where you, well, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole any further, but.
Yeah, no, I agree. But it seems to me there are ways to work with that, but this is why Auth0 has custom domains. So you can get your cookies all on the same domain and you're not using third parties.
Yes. So I don't know if Auth0 has a seamless login option presently. But if they do provide some sort of SSO, you could do a seamless SSO option if the domain policies match. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why they have a custom domain feature to allow that sort of reusing that.
Oh, okay. Got it. All right.
To allow that sort of avoiding of the third-party cookie issue, because they're on the same domain, it's not considered a third-party cookie.
Right, exactly. Okay.
So we started this with the discussion of strict, as strict is either, sorry, you're being kicked out now with a 401, or
maybe this should be called required.
Yeah, I would like a different name of it, is what I'm saying here, is, you know, it's sort of a reject unauthorized or something that you want it really, you want it really clear that you're saying, in this case, if this is true, you're either gonna have a good token or you're gonna be kicked out.
Yeah.
And strict isn't necessarily bad. It's just I like names that are obvious.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with you. So yeah. I almost like reject unauthorized, except that it has a specific meaning that is already widely used for TLS certificates.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily I'm making stuff up off the fly. This is something to be revisited.
Okay, so maybe required or require valid, or do you have any other thoughts? Because I agree. I think required already would be a step up.
Yeah, I feel like required is a step up, but still not quite to where I want to get to. It's literally like require valid. Yeah, but that still doesn't. You're verifying the JWT, and what you're really trying to say is invalid equals unauthorized, which is not a name, but
well, ignore. So not ignore invalid. You want to ignore or allow none. So it's like allow none, ignore none. Because yeah, we want to say can I get. I should never be able to get past this with a bad JWT, or maybe there should be an option for that, but I'm not foreseeing it in the immediate future for my use case or the use case of the people that will be using this.
Well, in cases where I've done this, where I would want to have it be false for the current API, it would be if the JWT is valid, I want to put that information into my request context to be able to use it for authorizing certain things. But if it's not valid, I want to put some other payload in there that indicates that they're not an authorized user. So that's why this reject unauthorized made sense to me. Is you're basically saying if you're not authorized, I'm kicking you out. If you, as opposed to if you're not authorized, I'm going to put that in context and tell you that in some way.
Okay. All right. Well, let's put that on the medium burner and just let that simmer for a bit. But I agree. Strict is not as great of a name, and this actually already came up with someone else. Not that they explicitly voiced, I don't like that name, but that they didn't like the behavior, and I think they didn't like the behavior because the name wasn't clear. And I think it should be something that is... Strict sounds like it would be false by default, whereas reject unauthorized, we already know, is true by default from the other uses of it. So I'm actually, other than the fact, it is still dealing with kind of like a certificate-ish thing. So I'll let that hang there. Okay, so anyway.
It's not really unauthorized, though. It's really unauthenticated, right? If the JWT fails, you're not authenticated.
Yeah.
And I think that's because unauthorized, you're not checking authorization here.
Right.
You're checking authentication.
Right.
So that in itself might make a difference.
Okay.
It's amazing how many times people who know the difference between those two things still mix them up. Right? You and me just did.
Yeah. Well, you could, well, but it's a strange loop because only authenticated people are authorized.
This is true.
So, all right, moving along. This here, I am attaching rec.jws. So JWS is the name for a decoded JWT. If you decode a JWT, it's a JWS. So there is rec.jws, and typically rec.jws.claims is what people think of as rec.user. So whatever you put in the token that identifies the user, or potentially if it's an access token, grants roles or permissions or specific access to whatever assets, that is what in other examples and documentation such as Passport is called rec.user.
Okay, so you have deliberately chosen in your verified JWT middleware to add .jws to the request. That's part of the verified JWT API. And then if people want to adjust that for their own purposes, they can add their own middleware function, as you've done here, to adapt it to be request.user or whatever.
Yes.
Okay.
Which might be a step too far because, you know, JWT is technical. Almost nobody knows that a decoded...
It's a very new term for me.
Yeah, it's just... the technical term is compressed JWS. The definition of JWT is compressed JWS, meaning that you take it from object form and you put it in string form with dots. So,
okay.
And then, well, yeah, I'll just a little bit of info here. So technically, a JWT has three components. It has protected, it has payload, and it has signature. Mm-hmm. So if you compress a JWS, then you get protected.payload.signature. And if you decode the JWT,
with the encoding,
headers is the object form of protected, whereas protected is the base 64 form.
Okay.
And then claims is the object form of payload, whereas payload is the base 64 form. So that is, and we don't call them grants anymore because OIDC. So claims is what used to be called grants, but now I think it's called claims because grants is making an assertion that it is granted, whereas claims is making a supposition that if you trust the issuer that you can grant the claims or something like that.
Yeah, the issuer claims the person has these characteristics.
Yeah. So, but they used to be the same basic thing used to be called grants. Okay.
Yeah, but I like the change from the perspective of the issuer really has no idea what the consumer of the JWT, I'll call it in this case, is actually going to do with those claims.
Right. Right. Yeah. So to call it a grant, we don't know that they will. Anyway, pedantics, but specificity of language, Jonas. So I think the rest of this, once we go a little bit further, I have this little inspect endpoint that doesn't need to be an example, but this is all just, I made a little dummy database where you can get and set any object and it will return or not. It's just a CRUD. It's just a little CRUD, and then there's some error handlers. So most of the rest of this
is an example application that you can use to test things out.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't really need to focus on that. But the part that I skipped over already to get to these, here's the bulk of it. This is what we're most concerned about, everything that's happening between here. So the session middleware, better name pending, is defined here. And this is what we pass into it. We pass in the issuer. We pass in the HMAC secret. And I think I'm going to move private key to be up here. So there's going to be 3 things that must be passed in. And then there's going to be the things that are optional-esque. I mean, you're probably going to pass some of them in because they're required for certain modes of usage.
But any one of them might be optional for a given mode of usage.
Yeah, except for get claims, which I don't like the name of it. And I'm not sure how to best present it because it is a function where you need to put your logic. So if we're looking at, I'll show first the...
So it's specifically a callback for the user to inspect the claims.
To inspect, actually to decide on what claims should go in the token. Not to inspect them, but to decide on them, which I'll show in just a second. But it's essentially, I would call it get user. But it's not get user, it's get claims.
And this is literally the developer needs to provide the payload.
Yes, exactly. So this is essentially like what we have here, user.findOne. And there's this callback that is this unnamed callback with this strategy wrapper around it. This is essentially the same thing, except that get claims is... I'll show you in just a second, but you get a string called strategy. Let me close the door, actually. Okay. I'll leave the door open because without the airflow from the house, the garage can get rather hot, but it's a cool day anyway, so I guess I don't really need to leave the door open today.
All right. Well, also keep in mind I've got 15 minutes to my next meeting.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to get you out of here then. So yeah, get claims. I would call it get user or find user, but it's more specific than that, as you'll see in just a minute. But the strategy is a string property called strategy, and then it will tell you this is an OIDC strategy or this is a challenge strategy or whatever strategy it is. So my thought is that you can define your get claims function, and then you can figure out what to do with it from there. If you want to break it out into 10 different functions, or if you want to handle everything in a large switch statement or whatever.
You're referring to strategy, but I don't see strategy.
I will show you momentarily.
Okay.
Notify is if you're going to send a text message or a link. Like basically this will contain the identifier, meaning the phone number or the email address, and then some details that actually you make up on the front end that are opaque to the library. But basically this is a challenge request has been initiated. You figure out what to do with it if you want to send a text message or an email or however you want to handle that method of challenge, which I'm only conceiving of email and phone at this point.
So this is another callback specifically for the purpose of passing that alternative channel message to the user.
Yes.
Okay.
And then store is just, there's a couple of bits of state that need to go somewhere, and you might want to persist them from server reboot. And if you did, then you'd want to provide store. Otherwise, it's optional, and just an in-memory store would be used instead. And then things like...
So you could create a Redis module or whatever so that you could store session info, session cookie info or something like that.
Yeah, particularly for the challenge, it just needs to be able to associate the different... Because the challenge may take place in two different browsers, because you may click the verification link on your phone or in a text message.
Yeah.
And so there's some state that just needs to be stored between that's temporary.
It would also seem to be necessary for any sort of horizontal scaling, so that different processes could pick up could line up the request and the challenge and the response.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so then the big monster is get claims, because the Google ID, that it's just going to be documented. This is the URL that you hit to do the Google ID stuff. And then the same will be true. There'll be a Microsoft client ID and whatever. So get claims is the big monster. And what I decided is that there's going to be a rec.auth object, which is already adjustable. You can set the auth param. And if you do, you can rename it to something else if there's something else in your system already using auth. Which,
before we go on to that, like you just sort of passed over that here's the URL to go connect to Google. It would seem like that should be either an object or an array of URLs to connect to for certain identified people, identified authentication partners, I guess maybe is what I...
So yes and no. I mean, okay. Now OIDC, Google, client ID. Like you're saying, this would make more sense.
It would be more clear that that's what was going on there.
Okay.
And then you could, like, if the user has the ability to specify it this way, you don't have to know all of possible future OIDC partners that the consumer of the library wants to use. You know, you didn't account for Auth0, you didn't account for Facebook, you didn't account for newfangled some new authentication provider that they've got a way to engage here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm going to leave this as a to do something like this. I agree. The reason I didn't go that route at first is because if you were going to, this is one of those things where there's a difference between the spec and the real world. In real world, people just call it Google Auth. In the spec, it is https://accounts.google.com. And for Microsoft, it's http://signin.microsoftonline.com/live or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like if we were really going to call it by its true name, it would be the URL of the issuer. No one wants to do that. Not even me.
No one wants to do that.
And so I was just kind of made a non-decision. But no, I get what you're saying. I like that a lot. So let me go up to get claims with our last 5 minutes here.
Yeah.
And this is the piece that, really we should have spent the bulk of the time on because it's the one that I want the most feedback on. But so it goes. We've got valuable stuff in here. I appreciate it already.
Well, we can do a second session of this some other time if you want.
Okay, and that might be good too. So we've got get claims, and get claims is going to receive a request object, and the request object is going to have an auth object on it, and the auth object is going to have strategy, and then depending on the strategy, it's going to have different things, but it's likely to contain email, issuer, and PPID for the OIDC stuff, JWS, if it is either the refresh token or the ID token for exchange. So if it's doing a refresh or exchange, it's going to have JWS. And then other than that, for the challenge, it's actually up to you because you kind of decide what that experience means for you. So I don't think I actually have anything that comes out of the auth object for challenge. It'll just say strategy challenge. And then you have access to rec.body, which rec.body would then have the things that you sent in for the challenge. And then basically, oh no, I lied. Sorry, I got very confused there. So it does have strategy challenge, and then it has the ID and the secret. And then it's up to you to decide how to disseminate the ID and secret based on what you got in rec.body that you sent.
So my first thought in looking at this is that rec.auth is very likely to collide with people's custom usage of Express. So I'm not sure what to call it, but I might even go so far as to say this is like you should name rec.whatever according to your library, so it's really clear that it's your stuff.
Okay. Yeah, and the library does not yet have a name. It's tentatively Auth 3000. I don't know if you can see that in the...
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll put that in there. Agreed.
Yeah, it needs to be something that is not as overloaded as rec.auth is.
Agreed. So then the other thing is, I'm thinking that the way that an example for this might look like is switch, strategy, case, exchange, and then you return, go do your stuff. And then default, I don't know, throw error.
Right, and so it's not just exchange, but each of the possible cases, you would have a put your callback here.
Yeah. And so the example might look something like this. And then you've got your, so that's the setup for it, is based on the strategy, go figure out what you would prefer to do for this. And then what you would like to do is you would like to take some of the information, which depending on the strategy might already be verified. So in the case of OIDC, if the email is not email_verified true, then it's just going to throw an error. It's not going to get to this point. Mm-hmm. So if you are following the OIDC strategy, then email and PPID will be present, and they are valid identifiers to look up the user. And we know that they're already valid. They've already been authenticated. If you're doing this challenge strategy, then this is more of a two-part process, because first you're going to get the notify, and then you're going to get the challenge with the... actually, I described notify before when I said the ID and secret come through. The ID and secret don't come through here, but maybe they should. Maybe I shouldn't have a notify. Maybe it should just be like challenge request and challenge result. I don't know. But anyway, you're going to get some information that you can use to look up a user and some information about what type of access this was, along with whatever is in rec.body that you can decide for yourself. And based on those, you return up to 4 claims objects, of which refresh claims is only valid for things that are going into the cookie. It's not valid for anything else. But you could basically say, here's the claims that are just the default claims. If you don't want to specify anything else, you don't want to get into it. It's just, these are the default claims, whatever, it's going to do the right thing. It's going to issue either an ID token or a refresh token based on what the process was, what the process strategy was. If you want to get specific, you can say, actually for this, I want to check rec.body.account. Go check and see if the user has access to that account. And then I want to give them access claims specifically with their role on that account. So maybe I'll put something like this, role admin is what I'll give back. And so you also have the ability to overwrite things. You could say, I want the expiration on this to be 72 hours. And this is all stuff that goes into that type of token. And typically it'll just issue an ID token unless you tell it that you want an access token, or unless it's the refresh strategy, in which case it'll issue a refresh token.
So if you explicitly pass back ID claims and don't pass back the other things, is that how you signal it's an ID token? Or is it like you pick one of these to return? Is it return one of?
So you could,
or
if you just return claims, it'll just do the right thing by default. If you return,
which it should be by the strategy. I got that.
If you return ID claims, then it will use this as the default, and then it will fill out ID claims. Or you could just put in ID claims, and that's also valid. But if you put in ID claims, then it will definitely issue an ID token as part of the exchange. If you put in access claims, then it will definitely issue an access token as part of the exchange. So you can have both, and it will return both ID token and access token. Refresh token, it can only do anything with if it can do anything with it. So this one would be ignored unless it is the
appropriate strategy.
Right.
Okay. This makes sense and is interesting to me. You've got some returns earlier in that switch that obviously aren't quite what you want.
Well, what they would be is they would be the function that then goes and hands back this.
Yeah, exactly.
Like for my OIDC strategy, I only want to hand back ID claims because they have to have a email that's been verified by me personally if I want to give them the access token. Or that actually doesn't make sense because you could still check that in the database, but you get the sense of it.
Yeah, the API here is not such that it required the API would allow the user to write one massive function that does all of these strategies. But part of what you're trying to do here is demonstrate proper uses of this API is with this strategy go here, with this strategy go there, but all of them should return an object that contains one or more of these properties, these claims properties.
Yeah. And at first I thought that I'd want it just like this, but that isn't sufficient because there are times when I want to return both an ID token and an access token, or at the very least, I need to signal this is an access token, this has roles or authorization type of stuff. Anyway, you're up against time now.
I am up against time. I'm just going to say, yeah, many times a login flow, at the end of it, you'll come away with both an access token and a refresh token, or an ID token and a refresh token. And so this makes sense to me.
All right.
Hey, thanks for asking me to do this. I really enjoyed looking through this with you. And again, I'm happy to do this again sometime.
Yeah, well, I would love to get a little bit more feedback on this. So hit me up if you have time later today, like another 20 minutes or so, since we've already gone through the introductory part. But anyway, I'll let you go. Message me.
All right. Thanks. Catch you later.
Adios. So that was a cross-colleague code review. And I think that these are good things to do, especially with people that you've worked with in the past and that you trust, and the people that have similar or better experiences, or not better, but are more experienced than you in some areas, or even people that, I mean, it takes both sides, because when you are code reviewing with people that are less experienced, you're getting a lot more information about how clear and intuitive is this. Like, as you noticed with my conversation with Aaron, he's done this Auth stuff before. He's familiar with Auth0. He's familiar with what these claims are. He's pedantic like I am, where he's like, well, technically this isn't really the right name. So you see all that stuff going on. And then if you're doing somebody who is less experienced than you, you're going to get a different type of feedback that's still valuable, good feedback. You might need to do a little bit more education, and you do need to pick the person that's in, if it's somebody that doesn't do anything with Auth and they're not interested in doing stuff with Auth and they already have a solution, might not be good code to have. I mean, could be good, might not be the most valuable person to pick, because their realm of understanding might be so far outside of what you're actually working on, and their interest in it might be so outside of it that the feedback that you get is of minimal value. But again, if you go on the other side and you're having a code review with somebody who is very experienced, then you may also not get the best feedback with that alone, because they already understand everything and everything is intuitive to them because they're already familiar with it. And so it's could be more just technical details rather than the some of the softer information they need. I think that this review with Aaron was a great first review of this. I do have somebody who is like Aaron could probably write this himself. If you might not write it because he might write something entirely different. But as you could tell, there's the ideas. I am going to review this also with someone else who specifically doesn't want to write this himself, which is one of the reasons that I'm writing it. But that is going to be also very valuable feedback as well. So anyway, babbling a little bit. But if this was useful for you to kind of see a live code review process between colleagues that now work at different companies, or prior colleagues and what do you call it when it's not a colleague, but they're in the same peer group as you, your co-professionals? Anyway, whatever. Go ahead and give it a thumbs up. You can like and subscribe, and all of the things are down the doobly-doo, the Twitch, the YouTube, the Twitters, all of it. And have a wonderful day. Adios.